For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is Unveiling Jesus Christ.
Welcome to this podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet, and we're now cruising through the book of Revelation at lightning speed because today we'll be covering 3 whole verses in Revelation 9, verses 2 through 4. These verses cover the emergence of evil spirits on earth as the 5th trumpet angel sounds. And if you haven't listened to my podcast from December 29th, December 31st, and January 5 of this year, I suggest that you do so because my discussion today will assume that you already know what's going on with these evil spirits that emerge at the time the 5th trumpet angel sounds and begins what we call the First Woe. I'm simply at this point going to start tying the symbols John uses in verses 2 through 4 to what we already know about the evil spirits that will be loose from the bottomless pit when the 5th trumpet angel sounds. For the nutshell version of this podcast, you can check out section 112 in my book. So let's get with it with Revelation 9:2, which states, quote, "And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit." Close quote. From prior podcasts, we already know that the first woe will begin when the 5th angel receives a key from Jesus Christ and uses that key to open the bottomless pit, which is hell. At that time, the hosts of hell, including both unembodied and disembodied spirit sons of perdition, will be unleashed on earth with greater power than they now possess. Donald W. Perry makes an interesting connection between the smoke that billows forth into the air as part of the first woe and Satan saying, "Hell is opened and evil arises," as the smoke of a great furnace, blackening the air and hiding the sun's light. John seems to be describing darkness that pertains to Satan, his kingdom, his disciples, and their works. The devil is the perpetrator of dark and evil things. The darkening of the air with evil is the result of Satan's work, for he is called the prince of the power of air. Close quote. As you envision the image of this smoke rising from the pit, consider these words from 1 Nephi 22:18, saying, "Behold, my brethren, I say unto you that these things must shortly come, yea, even blood and fire and vapor of smoke must come, and it must needs be upon the face of this earth, and it cometh unto men according to the flesh, if it so be that they will harden their hearts against the Holy One of Israel." Close quote. Now, this is obviously from Nephi's vision of the last days. And I've read this verse a number of times and have always kind of assumed that the vapors of smoke that Nephi describes are from the wars and fires of physical battlegrounds. But compare Nephi's vapor of smoke against John's smoke of a great furnace as a symbol of spiritual darkness. It kind of adds new meaning to what Nephi saw in his vision, and the visions are highly complementary. The 1599 Geneva Bible Study explains this spiritual darkness in the context of John's vision, saying, quote, "To this is added the smoke of the hellish and infernal dark spirits, darkening all things in heaven and in earth. The spiritual darkness is the cause of all disorder and confusion." Close quote. Now, I like this quote because it describes the effects of the spiritual darkness unleashed during the first woe. We will have disorder and confusion. It's not just people turning away from truth and embracing the dark. We're talking about anarchy. We're talking about lawlessness. We're talking about riots in society. We have scriptures that say the love of many will wax cold. Well, these are the kinds of conditions that we're talking about. And you're thinking, I thought we already reached that point. Well, yes and no, that's true. We're kind of seeing now what I would have to say is like the PG-13 version of events that will be rated R and worse when the first woe happens. There's going to be this great spiritual darkness, this vapor, as Nephi describes it, and smoke, as John describes it, as evil spirits ascend from the bottomless pit on earth. Richard Draper describes their evil presence, saying that John sees the evil pour out of the pit in the abyss. The Greek for the King James Version phrase, the key to the bottomless pit, is literally the key to the shaft of the abyss. The Freer is the shaft that leads down to hell. Close quote. Thus we see that the evil spirits will ascend from the pit or the abyss, the bottomless pit, the shaft, whatever you want to call it, with increased power in these three different groups that I've described. Those who are unembodied and led by Satan, who is the dragon, those who are disembodied and led by Cain, who is the beast, and those disembodied who follow Judas Iscariot, the false prophet. John describes this evil presidency of evil spirits in Revelation 16:13, saying, quote, "And I saw three unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet." Close quote. I've spoken about these three because that's how John breaks them down. But since we don't really get to the false prophet until Revelation chapter 16, which is 7 chapters in the future, you're going to have to kind of take it on faith that that's what we're talking about here as the bottomless pit is opened at the start of Revelation chapter 9. Many latter-day signs of the times will increase in their intensity and their fulfillment as the bottomless pit is opened in our future as described in Revelation 9. It will include these three groups of evil spirits that rise from the bottomless pit with incredible power from the dark and benighted kingdom of Satan during the first woe. Bruce R. McConkie describes these intensifying signs, saying that preceding our Lord's return, the prophetic word tells of plagues, pestilence, famine, and disease such as the world has never before seen, of scourges, tribulation, calamities, and disasters without parallel, of strife, wars, rumors of wars, blood, carnage, and desolation, which overshadow anything of past ages, of the elements being in commotion with resultant floods, storms, fires, whirlwinds, earthquakes, all of a proportion and intensity unknown to men of former days, of evil, iniquity, wickedness, turmoil, rapine, murder, crime, and commotion among men almost beyond comprehension. Close quote. That's essentially what we're going to be looking forward to, in a rather negative way, as the first woe opens in Revelation chapter 9. The three groups of evil spirits unleashed from the bottomless pit will deceive many as spiritual darkness spreads from Satan's kingdom throughout the earth. We're talking about a darkness that's going to spread false philosophy and theology, false cults, religions with abominable religious practices, gross wickedness in high places, including the church and state, signs and lying wonders that will deceive many. As this deception occurs, there will be iniquity and apostasy. The church as we know it, that is, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, will not be immune from the assaults of Satan, the beast, and the false prophet. Think of the scriptures that warn that even the very elect are going to be at risk. For example, the Savior gave this warning on the eve of his crucifixion when he said, "For in those days there shall also arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if possible, they should deceive the very elect who are the elect according to the covenant." Close quote. So we talk a lot today of being on the covenant path. Thus, we have Christ in Joseph Smith Matthew talking to people on the covenant path in our day and saying, even the very elect on that path are at risk of being deceived. And what happens if they fall from the covenant path and they turn altogether away from the church? They become sons of perdition and sin against great light. The first woe will bring about this great polarization where people will go from faithful members of the church on the covenant path to a state and condition of apostasy. The middle ground of moderates, and I'm not speaking politically, I'm speaking here of spiritual moderates, the spiritually lukewarm people that John described in Revelation 3, verses 14 through 23, like the Laodiceans. So you can check out 4 podcasts that I talked about spiritually lukewarm people from April 6th of 24 through April 20th of 2024. I also, coincidentally, if you're interested, did a video log of the ancient ruins of Laodicea, which you'll find on my YouTube channel called Unveiling Jesus Christ. And you just go on YouTube, find my channel, search for Laodicea, and it's a nice video about some of the ruins in that city where the saints anciently were spiritually lukewarm. The point that I'm making with all of this is essentially during the first woe, these people who are spiritually lukewarm, whether they be members of the church or non-members of the church, that middle and moderate ground is going to start to disappear. People are going to become hardened in their positions as truly righteous people who are overcoming Satan and those who essentially yield themselves to him. Elder Erastus Snow, who was an apostle from 1849 through 1888, spoke of those that reject light for darkness, saying, quote, "This is the condemnation, says the Savior, that light is come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds are evil. So many people walk in darkness at noonday, when the light of heaven shines in its glory and effulgence, they are surrounded in darkness." Close quote. The spiritual darkness of the first woe will be like the dense smoke of a great furnace. Don Perry elaborates on this imagery, saying that when the 5th angel blows his trumpet, John sees the complete unleashing of hell upon the earth, as the great abyss is opened and smoke billows forth onto the earth, darkening the world with great evil. This certainly is part of the fulfillment of the prophecy that peace shall be taken from the earth, and the devil shall have power over his own dominion. That comes from Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, verse 35. The angel uses the key to open the pit so that wicked spirits will unleash, perhaps as never before, their evil forces upon humanity. Close quote. Spiritual darkness will increasingly prevail during the first woe as the light of truth increasingly withdraws from earth. It's not like someone is going to throw a light switch where we go instantly from light to dark with the flip of the switch. Frankly, we already exist in a world with dimmed light. This is what Joseph Fielding Smith had to say 50 plus years ago. Quote, "The present turmoil and contention in the world is due to the fact that the leaders of nations are getting their inspiration from Satan and not from the Lord. The Lord's Spirit is withdrawn from them according to his promise. When a man rejects the light of this Spirit, his mind is darkened, and the Lord says he will withdraw the inspiration that otherwise would be his. If he is in rebellion, so we discover that men whose thoughts are evil have the light of truth darkened or withdrawn from them, and Satan takes its place. Close quote. We're already in the midst of spiritual darkness to one degree or another. We might say that the dusk that exists in the spiritual light upon the earth will become dark, and it will become obvious that it is becoming dark very, very quickly from the effects that will occur once the bottomless pit is opened at the start of the first woe, causing this increased dark that will billow up like smoke that blots out the sun. All of this is symbolic language. We don't have the sun being darkened during the first woe, meaning the physical sunlight. We have this spiritual darkness that has the effect symbolically and representative as though the sun were darkened and we're left with chaos and darkness. So what are the effects that we're talking about here? People will choose darkness rather than light. There will be gross wickedness. There will be massive corruption. As stated in Doctrine and Covenants, section 135, peace shall be taken from the earth, and the devil shall have power over his own dominion. Close quote. So what does it mean to say that he has power over his own dominion? Well, dominion means sovereignty, control, or alternatively, domination. So Satan's dominion is directly proportional to the measure of spiritual darkness that brings increased wickedness. The spiritual darkness or smoke of the first woe will bring the world to the brink of physical Armageddon during the second woe. Now note that I said we're talking here about the brink of physical Armageddon. The first woe is all about evil spirits and spiritual darkness, but this is not spiritual Armageddon, and it doesn't lead immediately to spiritual Armageddon. The first woe involves the increasing spiritual darkness and unleashing of evil spirits on earth. Spiritual Armageddon is going to occur in Revelation chapter 16 and 19, when these same evil spirits that are loosed in Revelation 9 will then be bound up, sealed, and put down in the lake of fire and brimstone, or the bottomless pit. So the first woe of spiritual polarization includes things like secular, political, international polarization as a prelude to physical Armageddon. We have to have armies in all the nations of the world arrayed together and against each other for the physical battle of battles that is going to be centered in the Middle East that we call Armageddon. Hiram Smith makes the connection between the spiritual darkness of the first woe and the physical battle of Armageddon with an analogy to the spiritual darkness that existed before the flood in the days of Noah. And he said this, quote, "But for this spirit in whom we live and move and have our being, the universe would again resolve itself into a formless, chaotic mass. When that spirit was partly withdrawn in the days of Noah, the immense masses of water confined below in the fountains of the great deep broke their fetters and overflowed the earth. Similarly, in this dispensation, the partial withdrawal of that spirit will have the effect of upsetting human society and causing a deluge of blood." Close quote. So essentially what we're seeing today with the combatants we call Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, Iran, the Houthis, Ukraine, Russia, none of these are physical Armageddon. We haven't even gotten to the first woe yet. So we have to hang on to our horses, which coincidentally is the symbol of physical Armageddon that we won't get to for several more verses. Revelation 9:17 says this, quote, "And thus I saw the horses in the vision," and we're now talking about Armageddon, "and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire and of jacinth and brimstone, and the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone." Close quote. So essentially what we're talking about here with the first woe is we're going to have a bunch of locusts who act a lot like scorpions. But when we actually get to physical Armageddon, there is a clear distinction between what happens during the first woe with all this spiritual darkness and the fighting and contention and wars that will exist during physical Armageddon, whose symbol is the horse. So smoke will also be prevalent during physical Armageddon, both spiritually and physically, but the smoke of Armageddon from the second woe will be literal as the smoke of Sodom and Gomorrah, which was literally destroyed by fire and brimstone, as we learn in Genesis chapter 19, verse 28, saying, quote, "And he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace." Close quote. Now, do you see the connection? We have literal smoke of a furnace during physical Armageddon, as was the case in Genesis 19:28. But in the first woe, we have the symbolic smoke of a furnace representing the spiritual darkness of Satan's kingdom that is unleashed, so much so that it causes this great chaos, confusion, evil, and wickedness that the armies of the world basically start going at each other's throat because of the spiritual darkness that exists within them. Now, some commentators, of course, make the mistake of saying that the smoke of the first woe is not symbolic, that it is the literal smoke of Armageddon, but these are two different things. The smoke of the first woe is symbolically synonymous with the mists of darkness in Lehi's vision of the tree of life. Both represent evil and spiritual darkness and powerful temptations. Both symbols describe what Bruce R. McConkie described as, quote, "an evil day, a damnable day. The gifts of the Spirit no longer pierce the mists of darkness which cover the earth. It is a day of apostasy, a day when men are ripening in iniquity, a day when the tares are being bound in bundles and made ready for the burning." Close quote. Remember what I've told you before about the fact that the first four trumpet plagues were designed to inspire repentance. We're now in the fifth trumpet plague, where, as Bruce R. McConkie says, we're now separating the wheat and the tares, those that refuse to repent. So I talked about this polarization. That's wheat and that's tares. They're becoming hardened in their position against God. And because they are becoming hardened during this ramp-up period we call the first woe, leading to physical Armageddon, they will be destroyed in physical Armageddon. Lehi's vision describes their departure from the covenant path, saying that Satan's spiritual darkness blindeth the eyes and hardeneth the hearts of the children of men, and leadeth them away into broad roads, that they perish and are lost. Close quote. Think of your own experience for a moment with blindness when it's physically dark. You stumble and you lose your way physically. The first woe of spiritual darkness brings spiritual blindness, when there are going to be these great temptations and hardness of heart. This will be dense spiritual darkness that can overcome, if you let loose for even a second, the rod of iron that protects you and keeps you on the path, and you can lose your way. It's going to be very precarious. That's why even those who are the elect will be at risk if they let loose of the iron rod. Now, compare this to like driving in a dense fog. And some of you may have had the experience. I know that I have. When you're in a dense fog, even though you've driven a road 100 times, you can lose your entire sense of direction, your being and your location. You know that there's a certain turn in the road and you thought, I should be there, but I can't see it. Where is it? And you start to feel a little bit lost and unsure of ourselves. We had that experience recently when we had a pretty heavy fog here in the Reno area. And my wife, Jan, happened to be driving that day. Now, we we have our mission office located very close to the Reno Airport Tower, which Jan uses to kind of gauge where she needs to make the turn down Reactor Way into the mission office. Well, the other day it was just completely foggy and she couldn't see the tower, even though it was maybe 100 feet, 150 feet maybe, off of Rock Boulevard that we were driving down. And so it's just totally foggy. She can't see it. Well, the next thing we know, we've already passed our street because she didn't see the tower. So what do we have to do? We got to go to the next block, circle back to get to the office. So if you put that in a spiritual context, it's easy to lose your way in the fog of darkness, even when you seem like you're on very familiar ground and it's been something you've been driving forever. So faithful members of the church during the First Woe, those who were familiar with the doctrines, the theology, the teachings of prophets and apostles that are familiar to them, that they have embraced throughout their life, have the danger of losing their way in this fog of spiritual darkness. And before they even realize that they're off the covenant path, they will find themselves in forbidden roads, and they will not have a desire to return. They will love darkness more than light, and they will become apostates. That's how they become mortal sons of perdition. Now, all of this sounds kind of depressing, and certainly it's something that you need to be concerned about. You're worried about it. And if that causes you to redouble your commitment to your covenant keeping, then that's a good thing. But let's step back and calm your troubled soul just a bit, because during this time of great wickedness and spiritual decay, the Lord will reign among his righteous saints in Zion. Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, verses 35 and 36 tells us that, quote, "For I am no respecter of persons, and will that all men shall know that the day speedily cometh, the hour is not yet, but nigh at hand, when peace shall be taken from the earth, and the devil shall have power over his own dominion. And also the Lord shall have power over his saints, and shall reign in their midst, and shall come down in judgment upon Idumea, or the world." Close quote. So as you can see, even though Satan is going to have power over his dominion during this era of tremendous spiritual darkness, the Lord is going to have power over his saints and will reign in their midst. Even though there's going to be this great polarization of righteous and wicked, the Lord's judgments on Idumea, or the world, will be justified precisely because people will turn away from the light, and therefore the Lord will be justified in destroying them when physical Armageddon comes along and thereafter. So knowing that the Lord will be in our midst is a big source of comfort, right? But then comes this cautionary comment from Joseph Smith, saying, quote, "Some may have cried peace, but the saints and the world will have little peace from henceforth. The time is soon coming when no man will have any peace but in Zion and her stakes." Close quote. So what does it mean to have peace in Zion and her stakes? If you go on Tools, that app you got on your phone, you can see your stake and your ward boundaries, and you know what the outlines are of your ward. And so that should give you a great sense of peace, right? Because, oh, well, yeah, I'm in Zion. I can look right on my phone app and I'm in one of the wards of Zion, and so I must be safe. Well, sorry, but I don't think so. Obviously, the peace that we're talking about and that the prophet Joseph Smith was talking about does not come from your physical location. The peace comes from your spiritual proximity to the center of Zion. Temples stand at the center place of all stakes of Zion. Even if your stake doesn't have a temple in it, the temple is the center place of all the stakes of Zion. If you can stand in that holy place with confidence before the Lord, you will be spiritually preserved. That's the promise that is being made here. President Ezra Taft Benson has said, quote, "We will live in the midst of economic, political, and spiritual instability. When these signs are observed, unmistakable evidence that his coming is nigh, we need not be troubled, but stand in holy places and be not moved until the day of the Lord come. Close quote. Robert Millet also gives this wise counsel in terms of our endurance, saying, quote, there are, as Latter-day Prophets have declared, many tight places through which the people of the covenant will be required to pass in the days ahead. Peace and protection and progress will be ours as we stand in holy places, as individuals and families, as we learn to be selective, as we sift and sort through the sordid and even the subsidiary. Some things simply matter more than others. The family is the most important unit in time and in eternity, and the home is the most sacred of all the holy places in which we are privileged to stand. Of this eternal institution, the Lord might well say, as he did to Moses, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Close quote. So you see, our homes can be an extension of the temple, and we must make them a holy place. If we do this, then yes, the Lord will be in our Zion, and we can have the reassurance that he will protect us as we enter into this era of great spiritual darkness that we call the First Woe. Now, I've frequently said that there must needs be an equal opposition in all things. Therefore, we need not suppose that when the first woe begins, we are left without an equal measure of protection. Spiritual protection will come through the hosts of heaven, righteous people and spirits from beyond the veil. Wilford Woodruff has declared that the God of heaven has given you the kingdom, the great and last kingdom, the only kingdom which has ever been set up on this earth to remain until the coming of the Son of Man. Although in its infancy, this work has a great and a mighty future, and, as I have often said, the eyes of all the hosts of heaven are over us, the eyes of God himself, and the eyes of all the prophets and apostles who have ever lived in the flesh are watching this people. Close quote. Now, I hasten to add, I think they're not only watching, they are having an influence in our lives. George Q. Cannon has also given this assurance, saying, quote, I know that the work which God has commenced in these last days will continue to go forth despite the powers of darkness and all the fiends of hell. Though they are arrayed against it, God and the hosts of heaven are on the side of Israel, and Israel will prevail. This work will continue to spread and increase until the kingdoms of this world shall become the kingdom of our God and his Christ, and he will reign forever. Close quote. These hosts of heaven will be given greater power on earth to aid the faithful from behind the veil, just as the evil spirits are given greater power on earth during the period of the first woe. Orson Pratt has spoken this truth, saying, quote, but the righteous in the flesh and behind the veil will come forth in the first resurrection. But prior to that great event, they will cooperate in their labors for the consummation of the purposes of the Almighty, so far as necessary to prepare the way for the second coming of the Lord Jesus Christ to reign here personally on the earth for the space of 1,000 years. Close quote. We can believe with great confidence that the hosts of heaven will have increased power in proportion to the increased power given to the hosts of hell during the first woe. Heber C. Kimball made the same observation, saying that, quote, the work of God is bound to increase, and just in that proportion will the devil's kingdom rise in power and strength and walk up to battle against us. Close quote. The balance of power between good and evil will not go askew during the first woe or at any time thereafter, leading to the second coming. Christ will protect and preserve the righteous in the spiritual battles that precede the second coming. Consider the experience of Joseph Smith during the first vision. Before the manifestation of this great pillar of light, there was this overpowering darkness that left him with a feeling of doom that was not simply some imaginary force. And at the very moment he was ready to sink into despair, he saw this pillar of light. God had not left him unprotected in that moment, and he was right there ready to protect Joseph. Given the increased degree of spiritual darkness that will engulf the earth during the first woe, this may be the appointed time when righteous saints on earth will begin to have a more open and direct communion with the hosts of heaven and members of the heavenly church of the firstborn. We read this in Doctrine and Covenants, section 107, verses 18 and 19, that talks of this expected communion between men on earth and the angels and spirits in heaven, saying, quote, "The power and authority of the higher or Melchizedek priesthood is to hold the keys of all the spiritual blessings of the church, to have the privilege of receiving the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, to have the heavens opened unto them, and to commune with the general assembly and church of the firstborn, and to enjoy the communion and presence of God the Father and Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant." Close quote. Now I want you to think about this verse and take it back in time to the meridian of time when the ancient church had been established. And as described by Paul in Hebrews chapter 12, we had this kind of communion existing between the ancient saints and the general assembly and church of the firstborn. But they also lived in a time of tremendous spiritual darkness. They were galloping into the great apostasy when the church would be completely taken away and would fall away. And yet these faithful saints had communion with the general assembly and church of the firstborn, as we are promised. At the same time, we're entering into these spiritually darkened times, including the time of the first woe. Charles W. Penrose spoke of how the veil will part for this kind of communion, saying, quote, "The time will come, and it is not far distant, when the veil will be taken away which separates us from our brethren who have gone before, and we will work with them, and they with us. We will be in perfect harmony, and the priesthood behind the veil will reveal to the priesthood in the flesh the holy temples of God." Close quote. So we've seen this before in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, as I've just discussed. Hiram Andrus said that this is the state and place of the ancient saints arrived at when they had such glorious visions. Isaiah, Ezekiel, John upon the Isle of Patmos, St. Paul in the three heavens, and all the saints who held communion with the general assembly and church of the firstborn. It is evident from this statement that the blessings of the second Comforter include, in addition to the manifestation of the Father and the Son, communion with the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which has reference here to the sanctified and sealed church beyond the veil. One who has the second Comforter might also commune with the spirits of just men made perfect, faithful men who have obeyed the gospel and overcome the world and are perfected by the power of God's glory when they depart this life. Close quote. With these protective promises in the forefront of our minds, let's turn now to Revelation 9:3 and continue our discussion of the evil that awaits us in the symbolism given by John. This verse says, quote, "And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power, close quote. By way of quick recap, in Revelation 9:2, we spoke of the smoke from a furnace as the first woe begins, and we now learn that from the midst of the smoke come these locusts. They are not real locusts, they are symbols. Joseph Seiss explains the nature of this symbol, saying, quote, "As soon as the mouth of the pit is opened, a thick darkness issues from it like the black smoke of a great furnace, a blackness which fills the air and obscures the sun. And out of the smoky blackness proceed living things, horrible in shape, malignant in disposition, and they are armed with power to afflict and torment men's bodies." John calls them locusts, but they are supernatural, infernal, not earthly locusts. Close quote. Some scholars believe the swarming locusts emerge from the pit in such great numbers that they become a dense cloud or smoke that literally blots out the physical sunshine. And there is historical precedent for this view. Easton's Bible Dictionary explains their presence, or the presence of locusts in such great masses that they blot out the sun, saying, quote, "The invasions of locusts are the heaviest calamities that can befall a country. Their numbers exceed computation. The Hebrews called them the countless, and the Arabs knew them as the darkeners of the sun. Unable to guide their own flight, though capable of crossing large spaces, they are at the mercy of the wind, which bears them as blind instruments of providence to the doomed region given over to them for the time. Innumerable as the drops of water or the sands of the seashore, their flight obscures the sun and casts a thick shadow on the earth." Close quote. So that's kind of the historical view. However, in John's vision of the first woe, the smoke and the locusts are distinct and separate symbols. Smoke represents spiritual darkness that spreads throughout the earth. The locusts symbolize the three groups of evil spirits that emerge from the bottomless pit. Likewise, they are not a mortal army with physical weaponry, which is the view of some scholars. Scriptures do sometimes describe actual armies as swarms of locusts. Hence, the mistake of some scholars in their interpretation seems somewhat understandable. For example, in Jeremiah chapter 46, verses 20 and 23, it states that, quote, "Egypt is like a very fair heifer, but destruction cometh. It cometh out of the north. They shall cut down her forest, saith the Lord, though it cannot be searched, because they are more than the grasshoppers and are innumerable." Close quote. The locusts of the first woe are merely a symbolic antitype for swarms of actual locusts in history that come as a judgment. For example, the 8th plague of Egypt was the worst swarm of locusts in Egypt's history. They literally destroyed all vegetation that remained after the destructive plague of hail. Richard Draper explains the connection between locusts as an ancient judgment from God with John's symbolic locusts, which are also a judgment from God in Revelation 9:3, saying, quote, "The Bible used this plague in a special symbolic sense that John follows. Judgment against the rebellious. God told his own people that if they turned from him, he would send the locust plague upon them. Infestations of these swarming creatures were so dreaded that even on the Sabbath, the shofar, the ram's horn trumpet blown only for sacred and very special occasions, would sound the alarm." Close quote. It's kind of interesting to recall that a destructive swarm of crickets darkened the skies in the Salt Lake Valley in 1848. The seagull miracle averted the disaster, demonstrating God's power to withhold judgments that seem certain. The righteous can expect a similar miracle against the spiritual locusts of the first woe. The horrible devastation from actual locusts in the past foreshadows the devastating spiritual battle of the first woe between mortal people and the spirit sons of perdition who will be loosed from the bottomless pit. When I say this will be a devastating spiritual battle, consider the imagery that John employs. Actual locusts are like grasshoppers. They have a voracious appetite and they destroy virtually all vegetation in their path. So as you think of that kind of imagery being associated with the spiritual darkness of the first woe, you get a sense that, oh yeah, this sounds pretty serious, right? Notice also that in Revelation 9:3, the locusts are given power as scorpions of the earth have power. Now, keep in mind, real locusts do not have a poisonous stinger like a scorpion. So John is mixing images that, number one, confirms their symbolic character, because locusts do not have scorpion tails. They don't have a stinger. So what is the power of the scorpion that John kind of incorporates into the image of this voracious locust? It is a power to torment, to cause pain, but not death. As explained by Marvin Vincent, he said, the sting of the scorpion is in the extremity of the tail. The sting of the Syrian scorpion is not fatal, though very painful. The same is true of the West Indian scorpion. Thomas says that those of North Africa are said to be larger and that their poison frequently causes death. Close quote. So here we have the imagery of a judgment during the first woe that torments mankind but does not cause death. Albert Barnes says that the sting causes this acute and dangerous suffering, which means that this again confirms this is not an earthly army. They're not bringing about physical death. This is a spiritual battle, a judgment that does not bring physical death by an enemy with a voracious appetite like a locust and unprecedented power to torment like the sting of a scorpion. The unrelenting locust will cause the wicked to suffer pain and torment comparable to the physical pain from the sting of an actual scorpion. Albert Barnes provides a rather sobering explanation as to the meaning of the scorpion imagery, saying, quote, "The scorpion is an animal with 8 feet, 8 eyes, and a long jointed tail ending in a pointed weapon or sting. It is the largest and the most malignant of all the insect tribes. Those found in Europe seldom exceed 4 inches in length, but in tropical climates where they abound, they are often found 12 inches long. There are few animals more formidable and none more irascible than the scorpion. Goldsmith states that the Maupertuis put about 100 of them together in the same glass, and that as soon as they came into contact, they began to exert all their rage in mutual destruction, so that in a few days there remained but 14 which had not killed and devoured all the rest." Close quote. Scorpions in the Old Testament are also seen as instruments of God's wrath. For example, in Deuteronomy 8:15, it says, quote, "Who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water? Who brought thee forth water out of the rock of flint?" Close quote. Now you'll remember, of course, the fiery serpents that were biting the Israelites, and Moses raised the serpent on the brazen staff that people just had to look and they would be spared. Well, turns out it wasn't just these fiery serpents. They were aided by scorpions. And so that's kind of adding to the imagery that we're here talking about in connection with the first woe. So these locusts with their stingers are like scorpions, are a fitting image to express the conditions on wicked people during the first woe. So let's now turn to the final verse for today's podcast in Revelation 9:4, which tells us, quote, "It was commanded them," that is the locusts, "that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. Close quote. Some scholars interpret this to mean that this is referring to military commanders who will order their actual armies to preserve crops in the lands where armed conflicts occurs. Others have suggested that this must represent chemical or biological weapons that could explain how people could be injured while grass and trees are not. What is going on in reality, and what this verse is helpful to our understanding, is that it confirms that the locusts with these scorpion stingers represent evil spirits from the bottomless pit, because evil spirits have no power to damage grass and trees. Charles Ellicott confirms this view, saying that the locusts, which are sent not to injure the vegetation, are clearly not literal locusts, and the security of those who have the seal of God in their foreheads, those who were described as sealed and so assured safety against the tempest blast, may confirm us in this view. Close quote. If we were talking about real locusts and modern armies, they would destroy the grass, trees, green things, and more. But the symbolic locusts of the first woe have power to torment wicked people that do not have the seal of God in their foreheads. Here again, I reiterate God's promise to those who stand in holy places that we call temples, and in our homes, who are true to temple covenants that include the seal of the living God, as explained in my podcast between August 13th of 2024 and August 20th of 2024. All this bad stuff by these locusts with stingers are not directed at those with the seal of the living God. As I've described before, God will protect those who stand in holy places, even in the midst of all this great spiritual darkness and these locusts of evil spirits that are gnawing away at everything that they can get their hands on, and with great power, like the torment that comes from the sting of a scorpion. Edward Zur explains the limited power of these locusts, saying, quote, "They were to hurt men only, and not all of them even. Their destructive work was to be against the men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. Such men were true servants of God, and no kind of oppression could actually hurt them." Close quote. Jesus Christ prophesied of our protection in similar symbolic terms when he said, quote, "Nothing shall by any means hurt you. I give you power to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy." Close quote. That's from Luke chapter 10, verse 19. What's interesting about this verse is this promise is given immediately after Christ said in Luke chapter 10, verse 18, "I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven." Close quote. So here's the connection. In Revelation 9:1, it describes Satan's fall from heaven as this great star, just as it was described by Jesus Christ in Luke chapter 10:18. Then, in Revelation 9:4, 2 verses later, we have these locusts and scorpions with a lot of power, except over those that have the seal of the living God. The possessors of this seal have the promise that Christ gave in Luke 10:19, that you'll be able to tread on serpents and scorpions. So do you see, essentially we have a connection between Christ's promise of your safety against serpents and scorpions that correlates almost 100% with the imagery of John seeing these locusts with the sting of scorpions that have great power in the first woe, except for those people who are keeping their covenants and have the power to tread on them because they have the seal of the living God. So it's kind of interesting, the connection between what Christ says and what John is telling us. So by way of conclusion, The fact that the locusts and scorpions have no power over people with the seal of the living God confirms again that these locusts with scorpion powers are symbolic images. It confirms the nature of the spiritual battle we face during the first woe. The seal of the living God includes the promise of eternal life, as I've talked about in prior podcasts. Those with the seal will be protected during the first woe. The seagull miracle in the Salt Lake Valley foreshadows the kinds of protections that will accompany those living righteously during the first woe. So don't let the first woe be a source of fear or worry. Let it be a source of renewed hope in the Lord's promises for his faithful saints who stand in holy places and who are on the covenant paths. So some may well say, well, I've been to the temple, but I haven't been told that my calling and election is made sure. Therefore, I don't even know whether I have the seal of the living God. And trust me, you don't need that assurance. It will exist as a matter of fact, whether you know it or not. It's like truth. Truth doesn't change depending on your awareness of it. People can reject truth, but it doesn't change the truth. People can accept it, and knowing it is helpful. It gives some degree of confidence and assurance in what we're doing in our lives. But the reality of it is, if you are living your life so as to have your calling and election made sure, it matters not whether you actually know that for a fact or not, because it is a truth. And so live your life, stand in holy places, and the Lord will assure you of protection, regardless of what you know or don't know about your calling and election having been made sure. So my counsel to you is to stand in holy places and know that Christ has promised to protect you against the spiritual darkness of the first woe and these locusts that are the source of that spiritual darkness. In my next podcast, we will discuss Revelation 9, verses 5 and 6, and more about the first woe, including its 5-month duration. So until next time, thanks for watching, listening, subscribing, and sharing, and to Jen and Kristen for all their help. I will see you next time on Unveiling Jesus Christ.